Welcome to Empowering Homeschool Conversations, your authority in navigating the world of homeschooling diverse learners. Featuring Peggy Ployer from SPED Homeschool, Annie Yorty from AnnieYorty.com, Leilani Melendez from Living with Eve, Stephanie Buckwalter from eLARP Learning, and Dawn Jackson from Dawn Jackson Educational Consulting and Tutoring. With over 75 years of combined homeschooling expertise, experiences, and perspectives, this group is eager to share their wealth of wisdom to empower your homeschooling journey. So grab your favorite mug, settle in, and get ready for insightful discussions, valuable insights, and practical tips. Give your homeschool the power boost it needs to successfully educate the unique learners in your home.
Hello, everyone. It's Leilani today. I'm so excited to be sharing with you a very special guest. His name is Aaron Brewster, and he is president of Evermind Ministries, and he is a biblical counselor. And we have chatted before, and he has some amazing insight when it comes to emotions and how to just deal with emotions in general as a parent. And we'll be talking about kids as well. So welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm super excited about this. I was homeschooled. I've homeschooled my children. I am a huge advocate of homeschooling, so I love any conversation that has to do with that for sure.
Okay, so did you want to tell them about your course really quick? Because
sure, yeah.
What you have done. Yeah, because I'm going to tie that in because I've been doing it.
Yeah, of course.
Go ahead.
So Evermind Ministries is a family of ministries. The goal of Evermind Ministries is to keep God's truth at the center of the human experience. But if we look at the human experience, it's so multifaceted. You're a mother, you're a teacher, you're a daughter, you're a wife. And so we wanted to have our ministry be able to focus in on those different aspects. So one of the first ministries in Evermind is called Truth.Love.Family. I'll mention that one in a second. We have a couple others. One of them is about personal discipleship and the discipleship of others, called the Year-Long Celebration of God, which has a podcast. Then there's also Faith Tree Biblical Counseling and Discipleship, which is our crisis counseling and discipleship arm. But then Truth.Love.Family, we have a podcast called Truth.Love.Parent, which has been running since 2016 and has over 500 episodes. We're coming up on 550 here soon. And we've just been loving cracking open God's word to help parents learn how to worship God better through their parenting. So I would encourage your listeners, if they're looking for another parenting podcast to add to the list, they can check out Truth.Love.Parent wherever they listen to podcasts. But Evermind Ministries has an app, and it's called the Evermind app. And you can download that and create a free account. And then you can access all of the different things that Evermind Ministries has, including Truth.Love.Family, including the Truth.Love.Parent podcast, and including a special gift I'd like to offer your audience today. It's called The Doctrine of Emotion. And it's an online course that normally sells for $25, but I'd love to give it to your audience for $10 today. And it's just packed full of stuff. It has some curated content from various podcasts that I've done all about emotions. It also has some elements pulled out of another course that I did for individuals who were diagnosed with lethal illnesses and injuries. We were talking about how to suffer well. And in the course of that, we discussed how to glorify God and how to respond to sorrow and fear and anger and depression. And so those elements are also included in this course. And it's just a bunch of stuff, different conversations that I've had, and some workshops that I've done for the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors that all tie into this theme about emotion. Why did God give it to us? How do we handle it? What do we do with it? So that course is on the Evermind app. It's called The Doctrine of Emotion, and you can share that link with your audience. And I hope they take a look at that.
Yeah, I'll make sure they go in the show notes. And so I have been tinkering with the app a lot and listening to things like on car rides and such. And the one that I love is The Doctrine of Emotions. I was even listening to it this morning. But I don't know, as I was going through it, just as a parent, just my emotions, and I know our kids have emotions, just understanding. So I don't know. I guess maybe I should ask you, some definitions. So defining terms,
Yeah, that's
emotions, like what are
really
emotions, what
important.
are feelings, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the super important thing to ask. So I want to just say from the outset that I too, as everybody is, there really is nobody out there who is emotionless. Okay, they're not robots, they're not Vulcans. We're all emotional. It's just we exhibit those, we show those on the outside in different ways. And growing up in my life, my predominant negative emotions have always been fear. Fear being the main one. And then if I lash out in anger or sorrow, oftentimes it's rooted in that fear. So that's something that I've grappled with my whole life. And by God's grace, the truths that I share have come from his word via me, via, the impact they've had on me first and foremost. And emotions are a difficult thing because really, to be honest, the church isn't talking about it that much. And so all of our understanding about emotions is coming from the world, either through education or through entertainment. We're just and even if they're not sitting down saying this is what an emotion is, just the way that people talk, we're picking up from them their cues about what emotions are, and we're believing things that are actually patently false. Now, there's a ton we could say about this, but I want to just kind of make it accessible for us today. And I want to do a couple things just to kind of set a framework for everything that we're about to talk about. Emotions are not inherently sinful or moral or righteous, because emotions are just what I like to call a pure emotion. Is just a chemical reaction in the body. That's all it is. God's given us lots of chemicals and hormones and things that interact in our systems that do a lot of great things for us. Excuse me one moment. One of the reasons that God has given us emotions is just to make life more enjoyable. We're not just rocks that just kind of experience things. We're not just animals with instinct that just kind of always reacting based off of just this unknown motivator in our minds. We have the ability to experience emotion, and they're all fantastic when they're all submitted and when we experience them for God's honor and glory. How that happens is part of the things that we misunderstand. But as a pure emotion, as a chemical that goes through our body, that's all emotions really are. And so one of the issues that we have when communicating this is the words feeling and the words emotion and how we use them. Now, most of the time when people use the word emotion, they're talking about what we would call a feeling, right? Because they're interchangeable. But they use the word feel to describe so many things. They say, I feel cold, right? That's a tactile feeling. That's because of nerve endings and things like that. May have some chemicals involved in it. They say that I feel happy. That's kind of that pure emotion that we're talking about. But they also say things like, I feel like you're mad at me, which doesn't actually have anything to do with feelings at all. It's more of actually just a thought. It's a kind of a sliver in their brain, a question in their mind that they express as a feeling. We use the word feeling to describe supposed communication with God. Like, God, I just have this feeling of peace that this is right. So we use this word feeling in so many different ways that it really starts to confuse our understanding of what are we feeling and what are we thinking and what are we believing and what are we wanting and all of those different distinctions. So parsing away all of that just for the moment, reducing it down to emotion is a chemical response, then we're halfway there to understanding. I say halfway there because the world doesn't go beyond that. If you're familiar with Pixar's Inside Out, they would give you the idea that emotions are kind of at the helm of our choices. What we say and what we do, emotions are there pushing the buttons. They're the motivator. But that's not a biblical anthropology in the slightest. It's actually more accurate to say that emotions are the consequences, that something else is pushing the buttons, and emotions can sometimes be the result of that. But the world also says that an emotion is pretty much just a stimulus, which they say almost all the time they'll say comes from the outside, which is missing half the boat. And then they'll say you'll have a physiological response, which then comes outward in a physical response to it. So as an example, a spider crawling across the floor, the person feels something and then they get on a chair and scream. Okay. That would be basically what they reduce emotions to. but there's a really, really important element that's missing from that description. Because you could have 3 different people, or you got a bunch of different people in a room, and they all see the spider crawling across the floor. And a couple of them will actually have the same chemical response shoot through their bodies. And yet they'll act differently. So a Christian, a scientist, should ask the question, well, why is that? If we could test, and we can, what the chemicals are doing and what brain chemistry is going on in that moment, and we can see that these 2 people are having the same physiological response, but they're acting differently, we've got to ask why. And without, again, going into a deep dive, and I've probably already spoken so long that people are like, I thought he said he was going to keep this short. But what's happening is this. There's an extra step that all of us interpret our feelings in one way or another. So what's interesting is this. 2 people in a roller coaster can have that surge of adrenaline that goes through their body. One person can interpret that as fear. Their whole life growing up, every time they had that surge of adrenaline, it was associated with something that they didn't like. They were told from their speech teacher that they had stage fright. They were told that, oh, you look like you're afraid. So they had it reinforced in their mind that this rush of adrenaline is fear. The person sitting next to them, their hands are in the air. They're screaming and whooping because they've associated that feeling of adrenaline with exhilaration, with joy, with enjoyment. Same chemical reaction, 2 different interpretations of the event, subsequently different responses in light of the stimulus. So as we talk about emotions, we need to realize that, yes, you are physiologically feeling something. But just because you're feeling that way doesn't mean you have to respond physically or mentally in a certain way. And it all really boils down to how you choose to interpret the event, the stimulus, as well as the chemical reaction in your body. And yes, I will say right off the bat that you can learn to retrain yourself to interpret emotions in light of biblical realities, which is super exciting. Because there's hope there that we can change. But anyway, so one more thing I was going to say was just that in the cause of adrenaline, there's another interesting point. Some people have that fear, other people interpret it as exhilaration, but also oftentimes as well, that feeling of adrenaline is interpreted as sexual attraction. So, which some people will say is like exhilaration, but it is different. And so that, again, same chemical, same process physiologically, but it's being interpreted differently by the person in the situation. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on this, specifically by Christian scientists and Christian doctors. I think that we need to publish more on this. I think that we need to talk more about this, and we definitely need to preach more about it in our churches to equip people to not feel, quote unquote, like emotions are at the helm of their lives, but that no, they control their emotions to many degrees. They control how they interpret and respond to their emotions, and really set people free by the truth of God's word.
So when you said all that, the first thing that came to mind was, as a parent of someone who has a disability, my anger and the fear too of, what's going to happen to them when they grow up. And okay, so when I'm homeschooling, I'll think of a practical example. So when I'm homeschooling one of my kids that has ADHD, and they're distracted and unfocused, and then I start to worry, like, are they learning what I'm teaching them? Am I doing a good, and then I get angry, and then I start yelling. That I can control.
Was that a question or a statement?
Yeah, I guess it's a question and a statement.
The statement is true. Yes, you can, by God's grace. That is something that you can control to his honor and glory, not the feelings per se. I think over time and with practice, we learn to control that. Somebody who sees that spider crawling across the floor can learn to not be bothered by it, not have the same adrenaline rush. In fact, I saw a woman on Instagram who apparently earlier in her life was just petrified of spiders. And now in her Instagram video, she was actually playing with one on a web, and it was going like this and it was going around. So yeah, we can learn to do both, but you can learn to control those chemical reactions But then more importantly, regardless of whether the chemical reaction is there or not, you can learn to respond in a biblical way in lieu of those emotions.
Okay. So now I'm thinking too, as a parent, but also when a child is crying and they're upset, it's okay for them to be afraid, but how they respond is what I can work with them on.
Okay, I'm going to dissect that a little bit.
Okay.
It's okay for them to feel the chemical response going on inside of them. What's interesting is this, and some people will push back on this, and this is fine. They can push back. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, and I can say this is my opinion on the subject. But again, since there's really only one major chemical that plays any significant impact in what we consider to be when we say that we're fearful or anxious. They can be produced by various things, medication, having the wrong medication dosages, having a fungal infection like candida or something like that can cause, sorry if you heard my dog bark in the background, can cause us to feel different things that we interpret as being fear. But one of the things I found that has been super valuable for me is just to teach myself that technically fear doesn't exist. And I'll say this for a couple of reasons. Number one, practically, because it's not actual fear. It's called adrenaline, and it can be interpreted and used in different ways. So why is it fear in this setting and not fear in this setting? Well, it was all about my choice. So why don't I just choose to interpret it differently? But secondly, of all of the commands in Scripture, the command to fear not is the most oft repeated. It's also the one emotion that is talked about more than any other emotion. The Bible actually doesn't have a lot to say about emotions in general, but it has a ton to say about fear. And so one of the things I think we can do as parents is the first and foremost is just to help instruct them what's going on in their body. The adrenaline response is given to us by God as a gift in high stress situations, right? The adrenaline response kicks in for a reason. And that reason is to make our brains sharper, our reflexes faster, our senses more attuned so that in a fight or flight situation, we can respond. What's funny is that we as human beings have added a third category. You might have heard people refer to fight, flight, or do you know the last word, the last F?
I don't.
Oh, good. You haven't heard it yet. Fight, flight, or freeze. And so what happens So what happens in the freeze one is that
I do that.
Do you? Okay.
Yes, I do.
Is that we get overwhelmed with the tool that God gave us to fight or fly. And because we're so overwhelmed with the tool, we're frozen and unable to fight or fly. And that's actually we're abusing the tool. We're not understanding it. That the freeze function has come up because we don't understand what's going on. And our children oftentimes experience that. So we want to teach them, this is a tool that God gave you. And you can tell them the stories about how in difficult situations, people were able to do really amazing physical feats, like rip the doors off of cars and things like that, because of this wonderful tool that God gave us in high pressure situations. So we teach them what's going on in their body, and we don't label it as fear. It's adrenaline. By God's grace, I remember the day it happened. My children, when my daughter was much older, but she said to me, she didn't say I was afraid. She said to me, I was feeling adrenaline. And I was like, yes, she's getting it. Praise God. But of course, she was already in her teens, I think, when I actually finally heard her say that. But if we start early enough to help them to interpret it correctly, we're doing them a huge favor. So then the second thing we want to help them identify is, well, what was that stressor that made our bodies kick in and say, hey, we need an adrenaline response in order to fight or fly from this thing? And oftentimes, as you know, working with children, is that a lot of the things that scare children aren't things that actually we need to be afraid of, right? The dark is a perfect example. The reason we respond to the dark the way we do has nothing to do with the intrinsic danger in the dark. It has to do with our misunderstanding of the situation. Sometimes it has to do with the fact that as human beings, as sinners, we're control freaks. And so we feel like we're out of control. We don't know if there's something here, and we start to play out things in our mind. So to help the child recognize, well, why was that adrenaline response going? Should it have been going? What can we do next time to recognize that, just because the light's off doesn't mean that our body needs to kick in the adrenaline, because God gave us this tool, but sometimes we flip the switch at times that we don't need to. So it's this process of, even at a very young age, even if they have special needs, in an appropriate way for them to learn to understand what's going on. You might get out a toolbox and pull out a hammer or a screwdriver and call this one adrenaline and call this one dopamine, or maybe not. You can pull those things out, and you can say, okay, now if there's a nail, are you going to pull out the screwdriver? No, you don't need a screwdriver. What do we need for a nail? And helping them to understand that in the same way, the chemicals flowing through their body in many ways are similar, that we need to use the right chemicals at the right time. But in the end, once they understand that, and even if they don't understand that, of course, really what it comes down to is every single time God tells us not to fear, it's associated with a promise of who he is. So fear disappears in the face of trust. Whether I'm trusting, there are people, we know the silly example, right? The child's imagining that this dark room is filled with monsters. So what do? They grab their teddy bear and put their blanket over their head because now they're safe, which of course is ridiculous. But if that were true, that there are monsters in the room, but in that moment, they are trusting that this thing that they've created is going to protect them. So it can even be trusting of something that's actually impotent. How much more powerful is it when we trust something that we believe is omnipotent? So when we trust that God's in control, when we trust mommy and daddy, that when the lights turned off, my only job is to sleep, and I can trust them to take their advice, to pray a prayer and tell God that I'm feeling this adrenaline, and I know I need to settle down and go to sleep and ask him to help me. And we're empowering them to see the situation biblically for what it really is and to think maturely about how to respond to it. Now, you can do that to your blue in the face. That doesn't mean the children are actually going to act on it, right? That's parenting. But this is a process that we can have in their lives, that we'll probably have in their lives till the day we die, of just helping them to understand truth and respond correctly to it.
I'm also thinking modeling too.
For sure. We have to be doing it.
And you mentioned, so dopamine is also one of the chemicals that flows through our body with adrenaline.
Not with adrenaline necessarily. It's just it's another chemical that we deal with. It's a neurotransmitter, and can have different effects on our bodies. That one's mostly associated with, I'm double checking my notes here, with pleasure. So dopamine tends to be that one, and that can get us in trouble too. What was that?
I said video games.
Yes, exactly. Video games, addictive substances, inappropriate relationships, right? Again, it's a tool designed to make Christ-honoring experiences beautiful. But when we use the tool in the wrong setting, we're reinforcing in ourselves a negative habit, a negative response to something we shouldn't be doing, something we shouldn't be interacting with. So yeah, that's another example of a similar concept.
Okay. And I love that quote, that fear disappears in the face of truth.
Trust, yes.
Trust,
yeah.
Trust in the face of trust. Even so, yeah. And I was just thinking about how.
No, what you said is equally accurate. I just put that out there.
I was just thinking that. No, I guess you could just keep going about emotions. And I think we talked about something before the show, just briefly, an analogy that you were sharing. I thought it was really, really interesting. And even though not everybody watching this show may agree with it or not, I think it's food for thoughts in regards to children that have unique abilities. And it gets me thinking too, because it is a lot harder for us.
Oh, for sure.
I know we have to look at ourselves too. And like a lot of this I'm taking in is how can I be more calm? How can I control my anger? How can I control my fears, or at least not have those fears by trusting?
One of the things I tell, and to that point, before we move on, because you brought it up a couple of times now, and it is super important. Again, if fear disappears in the face of trust, then what do I need to trust? And a couple of biblical truths that are very comforting. We recognize, first of all, God's sovereignty, right? He is in control. I am not. One of the consequences of that is the fact that you, Leilani Melendez, are absolutely incapable of messing up God's will for your children. There's nothing you can do that will mess up his perfect will for your children. Now, there are choices your children can make that will result in them not experiencing his perfect will, but experiencing his permissive will, which is unfortunate, for all of us. David didn't have to commit a sin with Bathsheba because he did, the Lord allowed that and worked through it. But you can't mess up God's perfect will for somebody else. And so that's super comforting when we recognize that God is in control and we are not. So even in those situations where you're wondering, is my kid getting this? What might stop? What is truth? Philippians chapter 4 tells me I need to think on things that are true. And what is true is that I have no control over this. What is true is that God does. He wants me to be faithful and to teach and to parent, not to cause my child to become something or be able to do something. God expects me to teach and to parent the right way as an act of worship to him. I keep it focused here. I do what I do, not to make my kids do something. I parent the way I parent, not to get something from them, but I parent this way because God tells me to, and he deserves my obedience. So keeping it focused here helps the fear associated with the horizontal relationships to melt away.
Yeah, that's so good.
In regard to the kids, this is true regardless of whether the child has special needs. This is true of us, children who don't have any sort of disability in their life. I did a podcast series called Parenting Angry Children. It was a 10-part series, and we stepped through Ephesians 4:31 and 32 and all the associated passages to try to understand what is the Bible talking about when it talks about anger, the different forms that it takes, why it's wrong, how we can parent our kids through it, and so on and so forth. The last episode of that series is called How to Help Angry Kids with Disabilities. Or especially as you put any word you want in there. But the points I'm going to make here, I have a couple points I want to bring out. These are true for all of us. So like the first point, we live in a broken world. Genesis 3:17 through 19, because of the curse of God in this world, there are thorns, there's pain, there's disease, and there's death. Okay, so we live in a broken world. First thing we have to understand, but that is still under God's sovereignty. Number two, the brokenness of this world produces pressure, stresses. Life is hard. Okay, you've given birth. How many times have you given birth now?
4.
4 times. Congratulations. Well done. Yeah. But my wife has done 2 after the second one. She couldn't do it anymore. Her body was so affected. She has a Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which messes with all of the connective tissues in her body. And her body just started to fall apart after the second one. We wanted to have like 10 kids, but God knew best. And so this that creates pressures. She has physical pressures in her life as a result of her pregnancies that maybe you don't, and maybe you have things that maybe she doesn't, and other women have different experiences. Now, those pressures in and of themselves, they are what they are. They're not inherently, I mean, we would say that they're bad as a result of the curse, but they don't cause us to sin. What they do, though, is they produce temptation. So before the show, the analogy I was using was if you take a child and you put them onto a playground, man, they're having fun. They're loving it. They could potentially, it depends on the child, I guess, they could be playing out there for hours. Some of them will go make friends. Others of them will just go play by themselves in a specific thing. Some kids are all over the place, and one will stay on the swings the whole time. But you take those same children and you put a backpack on them and you fill it with 20, 30, 40 pounds worth of weights. Each of those children now are not going to play and interact at the playground the way they would. Some of them won't get 3 feet from you before they'll break down and crying, wanting to go home. Others who maybe were super friendly aren't now. The kid's upset because he can't do the monkey bars. I mean, everyone, you can just imagine how your individual children will respond if they're told, go play soccer, or go play on the playground with this backpack of weight on you. That is pressure. That pressure oftentimes creates a temptation because we are humans, because our hearts are deceitful and wicked, because we are prone to temptation. The book of James tells us that sin happens because we say yes to temptation. So there's that pressure on our bodies. Now, the picture of that pressure can be a physical disease or a syndrome like my wife has, but it can also be the other struggles that a child may have that we don't understand. We don't understand the chemistry or the physiology of autism or ADHD or things like that. Those are pressures in their lives. Another interesting example that most people don't consider is, why do ERs and preschools increase their staff when a full moon is going to happen, or when there's going to be a big thunderstorm, or specifically a snowstorm? Well, in regard to the full moon, the moon and the gravitational pull on the earth, man, that moon just drags the water around our globe. It has effects on us too. And young children and people who are older, but also very immature, they don't know how to respond to that effect. The barometric pressure caused by an impending thunderstorm or a snowstorm, the air actually increases in weight, and little children don't know what it is. They don't know how to respond to it. They're uncomfortable. For most of us as adults, we've kind of grown up and we've figured it out, but they're uncomfortable and they don't know how to respond. These are the pressures that create the temptations. So whether it's barometric pressure, an actual backpack, or some unknown physiological thing that they're struggling with, this is going to multiply temptation in their life. Now, once we understand that, we have to recognize that the mature people, grown up, spiritually mature individuals, they are not insulated from this temptation, nor are they guaranteed to overcome it in their own strength. The Bible's very clear about that. But that immature people, they just give into temptation easier than mature people do. I think we all can agree with that. That's easy. A sibling, my sister, when I was younger, she's still younger than I am, but when she would do things to me in my immaturity, I would get frustrated with her faster than I do now. Jessica, if you're listening, I love you, and you never frustrate me. So in our maturity, we can give it by God's grace. We can move past that temptation. But the more immature you are, easier it is to give into it. So overcoming pressure, point number 6, is that it is both a physical and a spiritual undertaking. This is important to recognize. And this is why, ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully. Likely your child's doctors have told you that everything about them is physical. Their problems, their cures, their needs, it's all physical. But the Bible tells us that we have 2 parts. We have a physical part and we have a spiritual part. And though our physical parts waste away, the Bible has given us so many promises for our spiritual part. Promises that we can always escape temptation by God's grace. Promises that we don't have to sin. Yes, life might be hard, but we can still do what's right. And it is a physical and a spiritual undertaking. So I always encourage parents, yes, we want to do everything we can in a Christ-honoring way to remove as many of those unnecessary pressures in our children's lives as possible. Why are we sending them out there to play with a 40-pound backpack? Why would we do that? I hope there's a really good reason you would do that. And if your child has a physiological issue that medication is helpful for, great, pursue that. We want our children to be physically healthy. We want to put them into situations where they can thrive to God's honor and glory. We want to deal with that. And I'll just tell you, as a biblical counselor, one of the first things I want people to do is get a medical checkup. I am going to be looking at their diets. I'm going to be looking at their sleep. And I'll tell you what, those 2 right there automatically ends up being a huge foundation, in the stressors that are in young people's lives in particular, especially because they're getting very little sleep and they're getting a ton of caffeine, right? That has impacts on us. So we want to take care of the physical side. Why are you laughing? I want to know why you're laughing so much before I go on.
You said caffeine. I'm thinking about myself. Like sometimes, and I'm horrible at sleeping.
You and my wife both. She is the queen of terrible sleep. What's funny is that when we first met, I called her the queen of naps. She could sleep like a pro, but as she's gotten older, sleeping has become a lot more difficult for her.
Well, I also think it's funny because one of my children is actually seeing a biblical counselor, which
Awesome.
I don't usually talk to much, but I want to go. But the first thing that he asked my son, and he told me this, was, what is your diet like and how is your sleep patterns? And he thought it was really weird. He doesn't tell me much about his sessions, but that was what he did tell me.
Yep. No, then that's an important thing because there are real physical issues. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there are spiritual issues that need to be acknowledged. A person who claims that man's problems are only ever biological or physiological, they are denying the truths of scriptures. They're living in a delusion, and we need to acknowledge what the Bible says. So as we acknowledge that, the 7th point is that God never promises to remove physical or spiritual pressures. Okay, Matthew 5:10-11, John 16:31-33. We know that sometimes God even uses these pressures to help us to grow and mature in him. But the next point is that God also never promises that we will overcome all physical pressures in this life. Though we do have a promise, the next point, that we can always experience victory over spiritual pressure. We don't have to give into temptation and sin. We don't have that same promise on the physical side. These are important things to remember. Your child may never be cured. Your daughter's going to have Down syndrome for the rest of her life. And that is not God failing. That is actually still his grace in her life. And that's another conversation. But it's important to recognize we don't have these promises, but we do have this promise over here that despite the fact that I may not be able to overcome all these physical pressures and stressors, I do have the promise that I can have victory spiritually. So the next point, and that's 10 points we've just burned through. The next point is the nature of pressure is that sometimes it's physical, and sometimes it's spiritual, and sometimes it's both. And for the individual, we need to learn to identify which one it is. But for the parent, we need to learn to identify it. Because again, a teacher or a medical professional might be saying your child acts that way because they have this diagnosis. Well, we as a biblical parent need to look at this. Okay, I need to be able to tell what is physical and what is spiritual. And I'll tell you what, it's really, really easy. The Bible is not a medical textbook. All right. If you go to the scriptures trying to figure out what's medically wrong with your child, you're not going to find it. But if the Bible speaks to their behavior, if the Bible speaks to their attitude, if the Bible speaks to their words, if the Bible speaks to their emotions, you know that falls into that category of spiritual struggle side, affected by the physical for sure, and tempted from the physical too. But that you can separate out from the physical issues. I don't normally do this, I don't do this definitely for light reading. And I'm not a secular psychiatrist, but I have the DSM-5, the newest Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders here, because I always want to stay informed about what the world is teaching. And one of the things that is very interesting is that you had mentioned ADHD earlier. I had looked that up in a previous discussion. I don't remember what page it's on. But every single identifier, every single one that a doctor is going to use to identify ADHD is behavioral. There are no tests, blood tests, urine tests, spinal taps that can say that your child has ADHD. It's all behavioral. And some people will say, well, we found out that it's neurological. Well, even this book here says that when you look at all of the tests, they can't say that either. They can't say it's actually a neurological thing. So then we're stuck going, okay, well, if the medical doctors are looking at this and they're diagnosing it all on a behavioral basis, what if some of those behaviors the Bible says something to? And what if some of those behaviors the Bible doesn't? And that's where we as parents are to be wise and discerning, to help our children be set free by the truth of God's word that, there might be some things that you struggle with, like dyslexia. I'm sorry, bud. I'm sorry that those things are backwards when you look at it. And we're going to keep trying to help retrain your brain, but you might have this for the rest of your life. But you know what, buddy? You don't have to be angry about it. You don't have to be afraid of it. You don't have to be discontent that God has chosen this path for your life. Let's see what the Bible says. Let's learn about who he is and see how trustworthy he is. And I will say just, I'm not just, some people kind of get the impression that people like me just say these things and we don't have any proof to back it up. But as a biblical counselor for a very long time, I have seen by God's grace, people with diagnoses all over the spectrum get spiritual victory in their lives. They've overcome, not perfectly, but they've had victory in those areas where God says, this is a sin you need to stop, despite the fact that, yes, they do have legitimate physical pressures in their life. So this is where we as parents need to be able to sit down with the scriptures and say, okay, what do I need to deal with spiritually with my child? And what do I need to deal with physically? And what is an interesting connection of the two and how they work together? And we need to get wise that way according to the scriptures. I'll stop here with a few more points. Actually, just one more point to make. I'll make this point and then I'll let you ask any questions you want. So the final point there on this particular episode was, therefore, as we seek to respond correctly to the pressure in our lives, in order to help our children do it in their lives, we must understand the nature of pressure, God's will concerning the pressure, and God's expectations for us in the pressure. So 4 sub-points: never call something a sin that God does not call a sin, and never say that something is not a sin if God says that it is. Also, use every biological means possible to test your children's health and to help them be as healthy as possible. Make your children's physical health a priority, but also make your child's spiritual health a priority. I'll tell you that your average doctor is never going to talk about their spiritual health. And if we're not careful, it's easy to see our children as completely physical beings. And all we're ever doing is physical, physical, physical. And if we're doing that, we're failing them, because God wants us to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, to help introduce them to him in a saving relationship and help them to grow in him in sanctification.
So that was a lot. And I was trying to take notes a little bit here and there, but there was something. Okay, so a couple weeks ago on this show, there was all of us girls were sitting and discussing how sometimes we blame ourselves for our children's disability.
The physical disabilities?
Yes. And
my wife has had a similar experience. You
touched on that briefly, because saying that it's not our fault, this was God's will, this was his plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I thought that was, I almost wish I brought it up in the conversation, but it is a real struggle that I think a lot of parents go through.
Well, as far as we know, my wife has passed down her Ehlers-Danlos syndrome to our son. He has a lot of the markers for the same hypermobility that she does, and our daughter has a few. Since it's a genetic disorder, it's very likely that they both have it, but maybe my son has it to a different degree than my daughter does. And those same questions have come up. I'll be honest. I was honest with my wife. I've sometimes wondered if I had known that. If I had known, and Ehlers-Danlos, when we were first dating, whatever else, wasn't even named at the time. But if I had known that, would I have not married her because she might pass on some genetic syndrome to my children? Right? We have these thoughts, and of course, it's foolish. It doesn't matter what I would have done, and we can discuss the ethical nature of whether or not we should marry someone and have children if that person has physical struggles. But the reality is, what you just said, Leilani, is 100% right. That in the end, we're not in control of our children's DNA. We're not in control of their genetics. God is in control, and God doesn't make mistakes. And he uses these difficulties in our lives because he knows that this is what we need in order to become the people he's called and created us to be. And when we see it biblically, we are set free from that discouragement and that doubt and that despair that we might have, that we're somehow the harbingers of our children's doom.
Yeah, I had that same conversation too with my daughter, my other daughter, the one that Hannah. She came to me confessing that she sometimes wishes that Naomi was never born. I know that, but the fact that she told me, that's huge.
Yeah,
and I don't know, working through some of those things, just thinking that it was God's perfect. I'm really taking all of this in and just thinking about it as you're because
in all fairness to your audience, I want to apologize a little bit. I am sometimes told, Aaron, there's just so much information, man. You're like a fire hose. Part of the reason for that is I want to equip you with all of the resources you need to do the slower, deeper dive later. Like all those 12 points I just went through, and 4 subpoints came from that one episode, that one series. The doctrine of emotion that your audience can have access to is going to build on this more. So yes, take the time to work through it. One of the things I do with these online courses, if I find good material, I keep adding them. So one-time purchase, you always get the new stuff. And there are a number of podcast episodes from the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors, which also speak to this. And I want to add to that. So it's all curated in the one spot, easy to find, so that you can take that next level. Listen to this episode a couple times, make some notes about the things that stick out to you, and then target that as you dive deeper into what God's wonderful truth says about it. So I kind of apologize for the fire hose, kind of not.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just listening in, and I'm just taking what you're saying, and then applying it to my life, and then also thinking about my children and what they're going through. And even just with Naomi, you mentioned, the doctors say this, this, and this. Well, one of the things they've said to me is that children with Down syndrome, they're strong-willed, and that's just them. That's their personality. You're just going to have to deal with it. And that's true, but I know that it can be used to bring glory to God, as opposed to, I want it my way. Yeah. If that makes sense.
Well, but
sure. But then I'm thinking of examples in my head. So
Well, okay. So first of all, we have to recognize that all of our children are born into the world spiritually dead, right? They don't know the Lord. And one of our biggest responsibilities as parents is to be an evangelist parent, a gospel speaking parent, to introduce them to Christ. We have to recognize, though, that outside of a relationship with God, they are spiritually incapable of pleasing the Lord and doing things that are right. Now, they can have the right behaviors, they can do the right things in the right ways, but they can't really do it for the right reasons, the honor and glory of God, until they have a relationship with Him. So one of the things that's important to recognize is sometimes we as parents, and I will also say this too, I have a feeling that potentially I have a feeling, that's not a feeling. Oh, there I go. I think that likely, I believe that probably a large number of your audience members are females, right? And I'll just say this because in marriage counseling, I deal with this a lot as well, when ladies are married to men who are unsaved. And I say to the lady, you have wonderful expectations for your husband. You want him to be the spiritual leader in your house. And so you're always trying to do these things to help him to do that. But the reality is, until he chooses to submit to Christ, he can't do that. And really, you're putting on him an impossible expectation. Should he be a good father? Yes, he should. But until he reaches that point, there are things that he can't do. And instead of angering you or depressing you or making you afraid, that actually should cause you to pity his state and to pray for his eternal soul, that he would come to know the Lord, instead of just being angry at him because he's not the spiritual leader in the house. Same thing with our kids. We recognize the fact that at this stage in their lives, they are actually incapable of truly doing the right things in the right way for the right reasons. And that just should encourage us to continue being more gospel-centered in our parenting. To your point, though, about the strong-willed, by God's grace, that strong-willed nature, whatever that is, however we define that, oftentimes is what helps a child by the power of the Holy Spirit to say no to temptation when it's coming from their friends, to keep doing the right thing even when the world is against them. That's that whole greatest strength, greatest weakness thing. It's true, but it can't be our greatest strength unless we're submitting to God and doing it to His honor and glory. So most of the time, what could be our children's greatest strengths when they're younger, especially when they're not born again, are their greatest weaknesses. To see it for what it is, though, and to recognize it to what it could be, and to help parent them to that, that's why God gave us to our kids.
Wow. And another thing that, yeah, I just feel like that's so good. I'm like, huh. And I just want to sit here and like have silence and just think on it. Anyway, because I'm trying to keep this active.
If you're listening to this, just pause it, stop and think for a while and turn it back on. Meditate, chew on it.
Yeah, no, I have to, that's what I do. Like your things I have to do like bite size when I listen to it on the app. And it's nice because I'll do like a 30-minute car ride and then I'll go to the gym and I'll be like, huh.
You can pause me there. You can't pause me here. You can pause me there. That's
I know
good.
I could. Yeah. Well, everybody else can pause you. I can.
That's right. They can. Yeah. My wife can't pause me though. It's so think about that poor woman. Pray for her.
You said, and I thought that was interesting what you said about ADHD. According to the DSM, it's behavioral.
Well, according to the DSM, they diagnose it behaviorally. They believe that there probably is some physiological thing. They just don't know what it is yet. But they have to believe it's some physiological thing because they don't, even though psychology is the study of the soul, they don't actually believe in the soul. They believe in the body and they don't understand what the mind is, but they still think it's all physiologically related, biologically caused. So they have to believe it's there, even though they haven't found it yet. But the Bible for thousands of years has told us that the behavioral things that are rooted in sin, well, those are sins. And we have a different way of curing that. We have a different way of addressing that.
Is that what psychology means? The Latin?
Study of the soul? Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Well, I remember when currently I have ADHD, but currently I have 2 kids. Yeah. Well, I'm not shy about that, but I have 2 children that have ADHD. I suspect, the third one does too. But when I took one to get diagnosed, they gave him a test, but then they kept having him come back to test for seizures. I guess that was somehow related, but then we never really finished and followed up. But my other child, when I got him diagnosed, I just had to get a sheet filled out from his teachers, which we found we have a homeschool co-op, so we were able to do that. And that was it. Just check marks on a paper to diagnose him. And I was I don't know, I was shocked, I guess, that's all it took. But the other one had to do all this other stuff. And I don't know. Yeah. It's just I don't know if it's because it changed through the years or just different practices.
Yeah. I can't say specifically why they did that. I will say that most of the interactions that I've had with psychiatrists and psychologists and medical doctors, but by the way, what's funny is that medical doctors should not be diagnosing ADHD. Just like they shouldn't be diagnosing clinical depression and prescribing drugs for it. But the medical community that we've created, we've basically given them permission to do that, which is scary. Not that I think the psychiatrists can necessarily be doing it better. I don't believe that. But
he was a neurologist. Both of them were neurology.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's difficult when you're a parent because we've been taught our whole lives to do what the doctor says, right? I'm just encouraging people to be careful. First of all, again, the Bible's clear, and we have to always default to that. But the manifestation of ADHD is going to have a different root in many different cases. Not everyone who is labeled ADHD could be labeled that for exactly the same reasons. It's this gene, or it's this chemical, or it's this whatever. A person, let's just be honest, okay? If we're being honest with ourselves, you could have a child who is exceptionally unruly, who does not want to be educated, who wants to be outside, and that child is going to be diagnosed as ADHD, right? You could have a child like my daughter who had a retained reflex for quite a while. The retained reflex, I don't remember the name of it, but it's the one where you run your finger up their back and they arch their backs. A child wearing a shirt, sometimes the super sensitive ones, a child with their back against the chair of a school desk, they can get antsy and they're moving around. They don't know why. They're just uncomfortable because they have this retained reflex that should have disappeared a long time ago, but they're holding on to it for whatever reason. And that child is going to be diagnosed oftentimes as ADHD. A child who consumes a lot of Red 40 can oftentimes, their system gets out of whack, and they're having a hard time just focusing and managing their behaviors. And what's going to happen? They're going to be diagnosed as ADHD. And so ADHD can be, to be completely honest, in my opinion, that label is completely unhelpful, because all it is doing is it's telling us, well, this is what they're doing. It's not addressing the why. The why could be spiritual. The why could be physical. But if the why is physical, the why could be any number of physical things. And we have to do our due diligence by the grace of God and with trained professionals who are actually going to get to the root of the problem, to root it out, move past the diagnosis, at least the title of the diagnosis, and try to get to the root of it. And sometimes you'll find people who recognize that. A lot of natural doctors are starting to recognize what the retained reflex is, and then the food coloring, and the diet and the sleep issues that cause sometimes a child just getting to an actually physically healthy state. They're eating well, they're sleeping well, they're hydrated. All of those things that were labeled as ADHD go away. Sometimes it's because they're on this drug for this thing and it's messing with their systems. So we have to do our investigation. We have to do our deep dive to be able to diagnose, okay, so why are they really acting this way? And it might actually not be a huge problem, or it could be a deep spiritual issue. We just have to figure it out by God's grace.
That is interesting. I don't have any other questions.
Good. We've used our time pretty well.
I know. We're almost to the 60-minute mark. But I mean, we can go ahead and stop too. I just want to remind the audience, where they can find you, the Evermind Ministries, but you also have podcasts that they can find.
So if they go to evermindministries.com, all the other ministries are going to be labeled there. So you can look into Faith Tree Biblical Counseling and Discipleship, and you can learn how to sign up for counseling. Actually, we're having a really special program going right now through the end of July 2024, where people who request biblical counseling can get 50% off of the counseling fees for that particular ministry. They can also go on there and see Truth, Love, Family and get access to the Truth.Love.Parent podcast and the Celebration of God podcast. Celebration of God podcast actually was created as a tool for parents to help disciple your children for the Lord, specifically focusing on starting first and foremost with the holidays, and then working down to the everydays from there. And you can access that wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find it on the Evermind app. You can find it on the website. It's everywhere. So if you go to evermindministries.com or pull up the Evermind app, you have all of the information you need for all of the various ministries. And hopefully you'll do that. I do have a book coming out here, Lord willing, by the end of the summer called Quit, God's Cure for Family Strife. It's going to be a really small, manageable book, only about 100 pages or so. And it's going to be available on the Evermind app as well as a soft cover. So I'm excited about that. They can be looking for that on the app. Just want to create content that will help parents learn to worship God better in their parenting.
Awesome. And all of this information should be down in the show notes as well. So yeah, thank you again so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. All right. Well, I have no clue who's going to be next week running the podcast, but of course there will be someone. So I'm hoping to see you guys soon as well. So thank you again, and we'll see you next week.
This has been Empowering Homeschool Conversations, provided by SPED Homeschool, a nonprofit that empowers families to home educate diverse learners. To learn more, visit spedhomeschool.com.